welcome to this evening's very special event of Sue MacGregor in conversation with James Naughtie. A few thanks before I start. Thank you to the Freedom from Torture North London supporters group for organising this, and indeed to all Freedom from Torture supporters for your generosity in helping torture survivors and helping combat torture. It is deeply appreciated. To state the very obvious, without you and others like you, none of this work could take place. Many of you are already familiar with the work of Freedom from Torture, I know, but for those who are not, just a couple of very brief words before we get to the main event of the evening. Our work consists of three pillars above all: of rehabilitation, protection, and accountability, with the empowerment of survivors as the red thread that binds all of those three parts of work together. The rehabilitation work is what it sounds like. It's helping survivors to rebuild their lives, having been through the worst of the worst. That's obviously been especially challenging to do that in the past year, but I'm very proud, we are proud of the fact it has continued very strongly, both remotely and in person. The protection work, that work focuses especially on the Home Office and the challenges, the deep challenges of UK asylum policy at the moment and the attitudes of the government. We've got a new Borders Bill, which is going to be coming up this year. The Home Secretary said recently the consultations will start very soon. We're worried, to be honest, there'll be too little consultation. We know where it's going. We will certainly be fighting that if it's as damaging as we think that it may be. Some of you may have seen, and perhaps some of you already added your signatures, we have a petition for closing the barracks, the inhumane circumstances there. We've already got more than 30,000. We're hoping to get to 50,000. We'll be really pleased. We've seen some small retreats, but not enough. The accountability work looks at torture committed around the world and trying to shore up the torture ban, which is deeply under threat at the moment. Thank God, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that in a moment, we have the president who supported torture, who thought that torture, quote, absolutely works, is now gone from the White House. And I hope we're never going to see that kind of thing again. But nonetheless, the threats to the torture ban are still there. And there's a lot of work in different contexts we're doing to try to make sure that torture is both confronted, combated in every possible way. One of the focuses at this moment is sadly on the UK government, which, as many of you, the supporters of Freedom from Torture, will certainly know, the Overseas Operations Bill, a deeply damaging government bill, which is now going through. We've had a lot of impact in trying to get noise out there of why it's so bad, but it's still going through the Lords at the moment, we'll see. And finally, the survivor activism and engagement, which is a key element of each of the above. I feel I've already said too much. I don't want to eat up time. Many of you do already know it well, but those who'd like to hear more, we would of course be very happy to hear more from you and to talk about that a bit more. Just a couple of basic housekeeping points. You are muted and you don't need to worry about turning up as a cat on the screen by mistake. If you've been watching Handforth Parish Council, then yes, Sue MacGregor does indeed have the authority for all of this evening. Most importantly, you can ask questions through the Q&A facility, which you can see at the bottom of your screens. Please do keep those questions very concise and focused so as to make it easier for Sue and Jim to be able to go through those as easily as possible. So with that put to one side, our two guests tonight, Sue MacGregor, as all of you know, has done so many things. She's presented Woman's Hour, Today, The Reunion, and so much more. I think I can fairly say she has enriched lives across the UK for so many years. James Naughtie presented the Today programme for 2 decades until 2015, is now its special correspondent. His latest book, mining his deep wisdom on American politics, is On the Road, American Adventures from Nixon to Trump. Both of our guests this evening are unchallenged icons, I think it's fair to say, of British broadcasting. We are privileged to have them with us tonight. Sue MacGregor and James Naughtie, thank you so much. And Sue, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. That was very nice of you to say all those things. And I'm looking forward to talking to Jim, who I know pretty well. He's got a beard, which I'm not used to.
Demure. You know, there's the lockdown beard. It's lovely to be here, Sue, and lovely to be here with all our friends from Freedom from Torture.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be great to talk to you, as
Yeah.
we often do, but less so in the last year.
Yeah, yes, sadly. But anyway, the theme really of my questions to you will be you and America. And I'm going to start with what first attracted you to the USA long before you went there, before you'd been there. I ask you this because when I first got interested in the US, it was through my Aunt Sheila, who was a GI bride, who used to send me American comics all rolled up.
Yes.
By that stage of my life, I was with my parents in Cape Town, South Africa. So I didn't get to see America for many, many years after that. What was your first impression when you got there?
Well, it's funny you should mention comics, Sue, because I used to get a consignment each Christmas from an extended family in Oregon, cousins who were just a little older than me. And I used to get their cast-off books. They arrived in a big cardboard box. And I remember reading Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little and all these books and being fascinated by this big, wonderful place. But I suppose the real driver, my teens coincided with the mid to late 60s. And one gets to a point where you're not embarrassed to talk about age. And of course, the events of 1968 were so extraordinary, particularly 1968. But that period from the Kennedy assassination through to the end of the 60s, the civil rights era, and the extraordinary melodramatic events of 68 at a time when the States had 500,000 men, and they were men, under arms in Southeast Asia, Martin Luther King assassinated, Bobby Kennedy assassinated, riots across America after King's assassination. I mean, it was a time of amazing sort of drama in the US. And as somebody of 16, 17, 18, you couldn't but be drawn to it. And I was obsessed by it. And I went as a student in 1970 on the great circuit that everybody who wanted to go there used in those days, which was a cheap ticket on a charter flight and a job provided by BUNAC, the British Universities North America Club. And they allegedly placed you with a good job, which I discovered paid considerably less than the New York minimum wage. But you then spent a month going around the country in a Greyhound bus because it cost $99 for a month. And we thought this was a bit of a cheat because the previous year, Greyhound had stopped it being $99 for 99 days, which they probably discovered what was going on. I mean, all the buses are full of British students.
But Jim, how old were you when
I was 17. I was 18 when I went in 1970. And I spent the summer there, worked in a kosher hotel in the Catskill Mountains, which was a culture shock. There aren't many gefilte fish in northeast Scotland. And, well, there are, but they don't call them that. And I had a wonderful time and then went on the road with 4 student colleagues. And, I was dazzled and excited and lifted by its diversity, by its size, and just by the sheer churn of events. And from there, I knew I would be back. And I went back 4 years later as a student, and I've never looked back since.
I've read your book On the Road, which is very entertaining, and that you do
paperback next week.
Yeah, it's very entertaining, and you were a sort of how can I describe it without offending you?
Well, you don't need to offend me.
You were the dog's body.
I was the dog's body in the kitchen.
Yeah,
yes, I got the worst dog.
And you were the assistant salad chef. And it was quite hard work for you, but it was, in a way, you met some really interesting people.
Well, exactly. I mean, I was the last British student to arrive for the season, so I got the worst job, working under a Chinese New York chef who couldn't understand a word I said, and I couldn't understand a word he said. And my first problem, of course, was that I didn't know what any of the food was. I mean, I'd never seen a pickle, let alone, bagels and lox and mandelbrats and
they have pickles in Scotland.
Well, yeah, but no, bagels in Bafshire, Sue.
No, I said pickles in Scotland.
Oh, pickles. Well, yeah, but you never called them that. And, and obviously it was strictly kosher hotels. So the plates had to be, corralled for lunch and a meat meal and a milk meal and so on. And of course, I was all over the place on this and made some terrible boobs. But I had a wonderful summer, and I met a lot of kids my own age, Americans, who were working there, most of them, from Brooklyn. And I was inculcated into a particular bit of American culture, which I adored and, loved, and ended up sharing a house as a student 3 or 4 years later with a guy from Brooklyn. And by the time I'd finished with that, I felt that there was nothing I didn't know about, baseball or the culture of New York. But of course, the great thing about traveling around America for the first time, as everyone knows, we discovered that it's not one culture, it's 100 cultures. And, the South is different. The West is different. The Midwest is, different again. And so it's been a lifetime of exploration. And the reason I called it On the Road just seemed to be, it was no sort of reference to Kerouac particularly, but it was simply thinking that, as you know, Sue, in our trade, when we were, plying the microphones for Today, and as I still do in other guises, being out on the road is the thing we always loved. And it's a discovery. And it's a simple story of discovery. And the great thing is P.G. O'Rourke was kind enough to say that the thing he enjoyed about the book was that I confess at the end that I still don't understand the place.
Did you, at that time when you were being the dog's body in the kitchen,
yes.
That's your phrase, not mine.
Seems so long ago, yeah. 50 years.
Did you imagine that you might be working for the BBC and doing...
Oh, goodness, no. I knew subsequently in 74 I was going to go back to work for a newspaper in Aberdeen in the first instance, then the Scotsman, then the Guardian. But so I knew I was going to be a journalist, but I mean, the BBC was a mile away. I had no thought, and it was late 80s. You were on Today, and I joined The World at 1. And, we got to know each other in that era and then became, of course, very close colleagues from 94 on after the sad death of Brian Redhead when I joined Today. But I mean, that was, I never thought of talking into a microphone when I was, 18, the last thing in my mind.
How much did you manage to associate yourself with America and what you did there? What you did at that time. Hang on, I just want to say, how much...
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm just thinking as you speak. Carry on.
Okay, thinking aloud. When you were a very successful person on The World at 1, and I can remember sitting in a hotel, the St. George's Hotel, just opposite what was then the only broadcasting house, and seeing you sometimes coming out of the revolving doors with a sort of a Mac on, thinking, gosh, he's lucky. On The World at 1, you don't have to get up till maybe 6 o'clock in the morning or something.
Yes.
And that's sort of ended for you when you were on the Today program.
Yes, but I didn't complain about it because Today was wonderful. And one of the problems about America, by that time I had started doing quite a bit in the States, and I always wanted to go back, and I was traveling as a tourist, of course, in the summer, going on holidays and so on. But I began to be able to go for work more regularly. Of course, one of the nightmares, as you well know, if you're broadcasting live from the States for Today, in the course of an election or something like that, that means, if you're on the East Coast, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. So, you had to work in this very, very peculiar way when you were working all day, but you had to have 2 hours sleep and then get up at about 1 in the morning. And of course, the awful thing, getting up and sitting in front of the microphone in the studio with a cup of coffee is one thing, but you've got to sound awake. I mean, you can't just sit there. You've actually got to sound as if you're full of beans.
You always do. You always do sound as if you're full of beans.
Even if I don't know what I'm talking about.
No, you always know what you're talking about. But I just wonder, just before we get away from the early days, who were the American politicians at that point in your life when you were, who you rated or you didn't like?
Well, it was more a question of fascination than being sort of grand enough to think about rating people. I mean, I managed to wangle my way to both Jimmy Carter's 2 conventions in 1976 and 1980, both in New York, and saw political conventions for the first time. And of course, it's a fascinating array of people, from old Southern senators, crusty old senators, to Mayor Daley of Chicago, to Carter himself, of course, a fascinating figure, to Teddy Kennedy, who had a last run at it all in 1980. And there was this extraordinary galère, I mean, a mixed bag of people who were admirable and some who were pretty venal, but the sheer color and the noise and one's sense, for better or worse, that you were watching power, changing hands, being passed from people, some of whom were rather disreputable and some of whom were, I think, fairly extraordinary. And coming out of the tumult, really, that had begun with the Kennedy assassination right through the 10 years of the turbulent 60s, the crisis of Vietnam, which had divided the country, every community, families, to Nixon's resignation and the crisis of Watergate, which of course had tested the system to a point which only now, I think, are we at a point where it is being tested even more strongly and dramatically than it was in that period. So in the aftermath of that, America was in a very febrile state. And then, of course, Reagan came along in 1981 and said, don't worry, calm down, everything's fine.
He was Reagan, whatever you think of his politics, he came across as a nice man.
Well, I think his great skill was geniality. You're absolutely right. That was his stock in trade.
Remember when he was almost assassinated, and he sort of looked down and made some joke about, it just missed me or something.
Yeah, it's what he said to Nancy. Well, we've got to be careful here. It is alleged. Yeah. He said in the operating theatre, honey, I forgot to duck.
Yes.
But I think most people think that's a bit too good to be true. I think that, somebody provided the line. But the thing about Reagan, although he was divisive in many ways, he got away with a huge amount because of his geniality, which I think is the word. And the point about Reagan was that he ran his 84 campaign, a famous re-election campaign, under the slogan, "It's morning again in America." The sun was coming up over California in the ads. And what he was basically saying was, look, the last 20 years, to Americans who had been brought up with the idea of perpetual progress, ever increasing salaries and, better standard of living for each generation, suddenly the 60s and 70s had been a shock. Maybe America isn't destined to be forever great. And Reagan, it was Reagan who first used the phrase, "Make America Great Again." But the stark contrast between Reagan and Trump was in Reagan's style. Yes, Reagan said in his 1981 inauguration, "Government is not the solution, government is the problem." And it's a kind of phrase that's haunted America ever since. But he would never have behaved in a Trumpian fashion. And that was the difference between them both. And by the time Reagan, who was stricken by Alzheimer's, of course, 4 or 5 years after he left office in 1988, when he died, I mean, it was like the Queen Mother's funeral. I mean, Reagan had become an iconic figure for the country, even among some people who had, had grave doubts about some of his policies, and whether they were in the military field or whether they had to do with the courts. But Reagan somehow, for many Americans, by no means all, but for many Americans, appeared to be a stabilizing force in the 80s.
It's interesting, Jim, because there's nothing you don't know about America.
No.
But you pointed out to me that before, when we were thinking about what we would like to talk about, you said that at the point of the Vietnam War, America was as divided as it is now.
Oh, absolutely.
About what happened,
Well, I mean, I think it's a very natural span. When I was writing this, which after all is a kind of 50-year thing with bookends, from young boy to, grizzled old, bearded old hack, I suppose.
It suits you very well, actually.
Well, it is a very, very divided country now, and it was then. Personally, I think it's actually even more painfully divided now. I think it will be more difficult to heal the wounds. Of course, there was a generation that was poisoned by Vietnam, and there were, of course, 60,000 people thereabouts, Americans who lost their lives. I mean, countless thousands in Southeast Asia who weren't Americans, but it touched every community. But, once peace came, admittedly in humiliating fashion in 1975, America moved on after Vietnam. I think that this time, Trump's challenge to the sanctity of the electoral process itself, if there are, let's say, no one can number it, 15, 20, 25 million, 30 million Americans who really do believe and will continue to believe that there was some kind of organized mass fraud of the election system, that is going to be a continuing problem for American society that's even bigger than the one it faced when finally the last troops came home from Vietnam.
Have you been watching, I'm sure you have, some of the, I suppose it's, I don't know whether they're official or not, but some of the video stuff that's coming every day and almost every hour.
I think people, if anybody who's joined us this evening hasn't seen the footage, I mean, we saw some quite dramatic footage at the time, but the stuff coming from inside the building was patchy. There was some very good stuff, particularly Robert Moore on ITV. I think he had the best stuff on the night, which we saw really the next day, and you got a sense of what it was like in the building,
the Capitol,
inside the building of the Capitol on the 6th of January. But the montage that the Democrats put together by way of preparation for the Senate trial, which of course began in earnest yesterday of Trump having been impeached in the House, which of course was meant to point out how awful it had been. But my goodness, did it do it? It's quite clear that if some of the people who were there had found Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, in her office, or even Mike Pence, who was being excoriated by Trump, the Vice President, they would have physically gone for them and they might not have survived. I mean, it was that bad. And, you know, there were senators yesterday in tears, people who perhaps still will end up acquitting Trump, who were deeply affected by seeing that. And I think the more you see, the more you realize how close to the precipice people came on that night. It was remarkable. And if you look back, you know, Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York, Trump's personal lawyer, as he always says, as opposed to all his corporate lawyers, he made a speech just before Trump did, just before that march to the Capitol, in which he said, to great cheers, and most of these people then marched on the Capitol, this is trial by combat. I mean, it was a call to arms. There was no argument about it.
Well, it was extraordinary, but because people have, you know, Trump sort of, I gather, is getting away with it because he actually said nothing.
Well,
he said to his followers ahead of the siege, "Fight like hell."
Yes, exactly.
And then didn't take any part in it.
He didn't take any part of it, but he, you know, while they were there and while it was going on, and people were told in the White House who were pleading with him to say something, he eventually did. It was pretty half-hearted. But he sent out a tweet saying, you know, this is a wonderful day. You'll remember it for the rest of your lives. I'm proud of you. We love you. This was directed at people who were smashing their way in, who were looking for members of Congress that they could assault and, they said, kill. And they were reading his tweets aloud from phones to encourage everybody else in the mob. Now, I mean, leave aside what the Senate finally decides to do in its judgment, but the sheer facts of that speech and what happened, I think troubled many, many, many Americans to their core. And I spoke the other week for a radio series I've been doing on Monday nights on Radio 4, the third one will be on Monday night, to a former Republican congressman who's now a kind of radio shock jock, who began by supporting Trump. He came from the sort of Tea Party movement. And he is now somebody who believes that Trump is the most, you know, evil character on the face of the earth. And to be fair to him, I mean, that didn't come after January 6th. He actually made a symbolic run against Trump in the Republican primaries last year, a guy called Joe Walsh in Chicago. Very conservative, but, you know, far into the right stratosphere. And yet he believes that Trump is an excrescence on American democracy. And of course, there is a Trump base which will continue to follow him, but there are many, many people, what we might call middle of the road conservatives in a British sense, who went along with Trump. They always vote Republican, you know, this is what we do, who are absolutely appalled. I mean, some of them may well have voted this time, you know, in November, because they thought, well, maybe the economy is getting better and we don't like what he does, but, you know, it's better than the other guy. I think that a lot of these people are having a dark night of the soul now.
What do you think that Trump will actually get away with? I mean, it seems
well,
it's the received opinion now that he probably will.
Well, look, the chances are he will be acquitted in the Senate. It needs a vote of 67 out of the 100. It's a 50-50 split Senate. Nobody expects 17 Republicans to come over. But there is another aspect to this getting away with it, as you put it. There is absolutely no doubt that whether they succeed or fail, there are a number of legal problems awaiting him in what we might laughingly call now private life. There is a man, and I urge you to note his name, Cyrus R. Vance Jr., whose father, you may remember, Cy Vance, who was Jimmy Carter's Secretary of State at one point. Cyrus R. Vance Jr. is District Attorney for the Southern District of New York, i.e. Manhattan. And he has got his eye on the Trump family and some of their associates for all kinds of stuff that he claims he has evidence for. Now, fraud and business problems of one kind or another. Obviously, I've got no idea whether these things have legs and whether they'll take off or not. But the consensus in Washington is absolutely that Donald Trump and the family are going to be very, very, very busy with lawyers over the next 3 or 4 years.
Well, that's been made rather clear by the what is her name? Who's written rather a good book. Is she called Mary Trump?
Mary Trump, the niece, yes.
The niece.
And, well, she paints a picture, of course, of an utterly dysfunctional family. Now, none of us can attest to the veracity of it, but she paints a picture of a deeply disturbed person, with personality traits that are deeply unattractive. Now, I mean, I would not claim ever to have had a one-to-one sit-down conversation with Donald Trump. You can judge for yourselves whether I'm upset about that or not. I mean, it would be interesting, wouldn't it? But I think what you have to remember is that a lot of very, very senior people around him, Jim Mattis, former Defense Secretary, John Bolton, dedicated neoconservative, who was for a time National Security Advisor, McMaster, who was one of the National Security Advisors. He went through them rather quickly. Rex Tillerson, the former Secretary of State, they have all either written books or articles in which they have been contemptuous of the president. And there has never been a cohort of people who've worked so closely with a president of the United States who so quickly have gone public and said that they weren't just angered by some of his decisions, but they were disturbed by his policy making, by the way he ran the White House, and Bolton describes him as utterly ignorant of world affairs. And in his book, he tells an extraordinary story of being at a meeting with Theresa May. I can't remember if it was in the White House, but I think it was in the UK, one of their encounters. And Trump didn't particularly like her. Apparently, he called her a loser, which, he's just lost. But anyway, there we go. And Bolton says there was a conversation in which, a private conversation, government conversation, and in which May mentioned NATO and Britain's nuclear deterrent. At which point Bolton said Trump looked up rather surprised and indicated that he hadn't realized that Britain was a nuclear power. Now, I mean, for the United States, I mean, that's a bit like, I don't know, Alec Ferguson, when he was managing Manchester United, saying he didn't know that Jose Mourinho was managing Chelsea. I mean, it's just kind of ridiculous. But that, that was the level of bumblingness that, I'm not saying it, I'm reporting that that's what people who were inside say about it. And I think the more time passes, the more we'll learn about the chaotic stuff. And, I think there are many people in the States who think that that election, which was extraordinarily close, of course, in some ways, in which Donald Trump got 74 million votes, had it gone the other way, we'd be in a very, very, very troubled country.
Jim, you said something interesting a few minutes ago, which was that Trump has a lot of things waiting for him to do with the law and breaking the law and all that. And I can remember in the early days of Trump's presidency that he said, and he often repeated it after that, but I remember gasping when he said that he had only ever paid taxes of something like $750 ever.
It's almost exactly what it was.
Yeah,
I mean, and he boasted about it. I mean, during the debates in 2016, I was at one of the debates where Hillary Clinton accused him of not paying his taxes. And Trump said, that makes me smart.
Yes.
Now, I mean, you've got to hand it to him. To say that in a presidential debate is quite extraordinary.
Well, do you think
he broke all the rules?
Do you think that now that people know a lot more about him and do you think he'll actually have to start paying taxes? I mean,
well, we'll set, the New York Times had a leak, where that figure came from, that suggested that he'd used every mechanism in the world to reduce them, and they did not accuse him of doing that illegally. They simply said this is not a way to behave. We'll see what happens on that. But the point about, people often ask, why did he get 74 million votes if he behaved like this? And so many people, serious people and serious Republicans thought he was, I mean, George Bush didn't vote for him in 2016, obviously didn't vote for him in 2020 either. George Bush voted for Hillary Clinton. So did his father, and so did his brother, and so did his wife. And they made that public because they can't bear him. And nonetheless, he got 74 million votes. People say, why? Well, because Trump broke the rules, tore up trade agreements. He broke the rules in all kinds of ways at home. But what he did do, in a crude way, was to kickstart the economy for a lot of people who'd been having a rough time. Now, there are all sorts of arguments about the regulations he removed, especially in the environment and to do with unions and workplaces, all kinds of things to do with workplace safety and all the rest of it. And hugely politically contentious things. But a lot of people did find that in 17 and 18, their wages were going up. And the reason that 74 million people still voted for him, and I would bet that a big chunk of that vote consisted of people who, for one reason or other, didn't like him and perhaps found him an embarrassment, but they just thought, well, hang on, life is getting a little better in the family pocketbook, therefore we'll stick with him. And I think that's what's often underestimated here, because people just see the bumbling figure on the world stage or read his tweets and they say, well, how could anybody vote for that? Well, economically, things did look before COVID as if they were getting better.
What's your hunch then? And then we'll move on to something else, if we may. But what's your hunch about what Trump will be like in 6 months' time?
Oh, well, absolutely nobody knows. I mean, there are basically two schools of thought. I mean, one, that he's going to be, the troublemaker who can't be kept off the TV, and he'll be stirring it up, and he'll be organizing attempted putches of Republican senators, and all the Congress, members of Congress, of course, and members of the House are up for re-election in the midterm elections in a year in November. And, the argument is that Trump will go around trying to depose people who slighted him, particularly at the moment when he claimed election fraud. There are other people who say that he'll just shrink and go away. I think the answer is probably somewhere in between, and he'll cause a lot of noise. But, the predominant feeling at the moment, I mean, I haven't been out since mid-November, but, for obvious COVID reasons, but I was hoping to go to the inauguration, but I've been talking to a lot of people and doing interviews in the last months for this series. And there is generally a feeling, and it's not confined to Democrats, who, of course, politically wanted to get rid of him anyway, that there's a feeling of kind of relief, the anger is over. Somebody said to me the other night, you don't wake up and turn on the television wondering what insanity has, visited, his word, not mine, come out of on a tweet. And of course, many of the people who served in his administration thought his tweets were absolutely appalling. I mean, I must tell you a story which is in the book, actually. There's a character called Anthony Scaramucci who had a few moments in the sun. He was a Trump donor. He didn't like him in the beginning, but he saw he was going to win. So he started putting money into his campaign in 2016. He's a hedge fund guy in New York and a big Republican. I got to know him quite well. And I went to see him about 4 days before the election in 2016. He's since turned into a fanatically anti-Trump person. But in those days, he was backing him. And I went to see him, I think it was Thursday before polling day in 2016. I'd been at the Democrats over in Brooklyn, went to see him. And he said, I think we've got a 55% chance of winning. I didn't think he believed it. But anyway, we did the interview and he walked me to the elevator. And he said, well, I think we could do it. I think we might surprise people. You never know. It'll be touch and go. And then he said, but we've got one good promise out of Donald if he wins. And I said, well, I'm sort of interested. What's that? And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, no more tweets. He's told us that the tweets will be put into the White House communications officer. Well, I've sent Scaramucci messages since saying, I remember what you said about 6 times a day. I mean,
somebody's been actually counting the number of tweets, and I was amazed. It was only something like 36,000. But anyway.
But I mean, you can't forget them. Anyway, let's consign him to the side of this discussion.
Exactly, because I'd be interested to know about your first impressions of the new President Joe Biden. Because hang on, let me just
sure.
Let me just tell you very, very quickly what I feel about him, which is I think he sounds a thoroughly decent man and intelligent, and I just wondered what he can actually do to make a better mark than that of his presidency. Will he be able to retrieve some of the things that that Trump just chucked away?
Well, I think
specifically Iran, for instance,
right? Yeah.
And climate change. What can he actually do?
Well, I think that you put your finger on it there, Sue. I mean, Iran's going to be difficult. They're going back into the multinational effort to get the protocols strengthened on the nuclear developments. Tony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, said in his confirmation hearings that's going to be a slow business, but they're clearly going on a different track from the Trump one. They're going for a multilateral approach, which is what, of course, the Europeans and the UN wanted all along. But you put your finger on the climate change point. I think if you look at what what Biden is going to do, first of all, there's this huge package, 1.9 trillion, which is nearly $2,000 billion rescue package. It's equivalent to Roosevelt's New Deal. It's on that scale. Each American will be getting, incidentally, a check for $1,400, basically with Biden's name on it, which is, it's going to be very, very direct. And a lot of that will go into infrastructure and things that people notice. And so he's learned from Trump that there's no point talking about world trade unless you say this will give you jobs. And he's going to inherit a lot of Trump's trade ideas. Quietly, they will accept that in some respects they think Trump was right. But the green stuff, Biden really believes it. There's a political reason too, because the two wings of the Democratic Party are united, although there are big differences of emphasis on it, but they're united on the principles of serious environmental reform. And Biden is taking that very, very seriously. He's made John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, his climate envoy. He's sitting on the top floor of the State Department alongside Blinken. He's going to lead the Americans at the Glasgow conference of next steps under the Paris Agreement, which Biden went back into on day one. And think about it this way. Biden, who's 80 next year, is saying, look, I'm going to be a president for younger Americans. He knows that the generation under 40, and particularly those in their 20s, are obsessed by the environment crisis. I mean, it is the number one issue by a mile. Of course, if you're older, you're worried about paying college fees. You're worried about all kinds of things, healthcare and so on. If you're young, it's the environment. And I think there's a tide running. And Biden is saying, look, what I want to do is to take off the shackles and create jobs. Now, it's been said before and it didn't happen. What he is betting is that corporate America is ready to spin round and say, look, if we can get our hands on green innovation, if we can come up with the solutions, we'll lead the world. It's a classic kind of American innovation thing. And I think you're right. And I think he will make climate change a bigger part of his, his presidency, a badge of his presidency to an extent that I think will surprise a lot of people.
This brings me very neatly to something I was going to ask you about. And I'm sure you know that Joe Biden spoke to President Xi Jinping. Sorry, I beg Xi Jinping on the phone for 2 hours last night, the president of China, who doesn't give a fig about climate change or anything like that. But he said, this is Joe Biden. He said that that China is investing about, I don't know, billions of dollars in engineering and high tech, which Joe Biden, found very interesting. And one wonders what the real point of that phone call was.
Well, I think the real point of it is that China is the biggest global competitor to the United States in the future. The Russian economy is a very dodgy item. China, although it's got all sorts of problems, is, presenting itself as a superpower challenge economically, militarily, and of course in cyberspace. The China challenge is one that America has to cope with, doesn't have a choice. Now, Trump just did it through trade. Frankly, he didn't care about the Uyghurs. I mean, it's true that Mike Pompeo, his second Secretary of State, did talk a lot about that, but you didn't hear much about Hong Kong and the suppression of democratic rights there from Trump. Biden has got a slight problem because he wants to engage with China with difficulty and toughly on trade, on economic cooperations, and above all on China, on green matters. But he also wants to make a stand on human rights. And, people listening tonight in the company of, Freedom from Torture and the North London Supporters Group will be interested in this. I mean, I think that the Uyghurs particularly, but more generally, the crackdown on dissenters in China is one that you'll hear a lot of from the Biden administration. And of course, that means there's a problem because negotiations that they want to proceed on other matters may well be held up by that. But I think you'll find Biden talking about them. The other thing to remember, you talked about how much China was spending on technology. China's got a huge problem as a consequence of climate change. I mean, the shifting patterns of water coming down from the mountains are causing an enormous potential economic difficulty. China's having to build basically huge pipelines to carry water to places that are going to be dry. I mean, they know, we see all these pictures of coal-fired power stations, but China knows what's going on. And Biden's bet is that if you deal with China with a coalition of the willing, principally Europeans, Japan, obviously Australia, and much less so India on this subject, you can actually make progress in the environment. Now, maybe that's whistling in the wind, but he knows Xi quite well. I mean, he spent a week with Xi years ago. He spent a week with Biden in America. I mean, they are on terms. I mean, if you can be on terms.
They've known each other for a while.
They have, yeah.
Yeah.
And Biden's an old slap. You're quite right about Biden. You said a moment ago, he's quite a sort of genial and, backslapping kind of guy. And that is what he is. I mean, that's his nature. He's a politician, like, an old Irish American politician. I mean, he doesn't drink, which is the difference for most of them, but he's a very genial character, and he likes to do deals, and he likes to sit down and shut the door and say, we're not going out until we've sorted this out. You're right. That's the kind of guy he is.
I'll ask you to correspond. This is a silly word in the circumstances, but we've got some questions from the audience.
Great.
As it were, for a minute or two.
Can I ask you a question before we go? Oh, well, okay. No, don't worry.
I just wanted to sort of round this particular one off. America is still surely the world's richest and most important country. China is sort of sniffing very hard at that sort of title, I would have thought. How quickly do you think that China could actually become the world's most important and rich country?
I mean, you talk to three economists or global strategists and you get three different answers as ever on this question. But no, the fact is China is absolutely determined to maximize its economic strength and, of course, its military strength in Southeast Asia. And I talked to a former prime minister the other day of Australia, Kevin Rudd, who's a China man. And he said, look, from Xi Jinping's point of view, Trump's presidency was win-win. It was all about the trade war, and they could take or leave a trade war, and they just got on with it. And it'll be much more difficult with Biden, I think. But look, China and America are going to be the two great competitors. And the point about it is that it's not like the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where there was just a kind of standoff for 50 years, basically. Neither side actually wanted to make the move. With China, that's not true. And I think the Americans, because this has all happened in the last 30 years, well, maybe less, the Americans are still trying to work out how you deal with China, because the old idea was, if you get the economy of China going and loosening up, and it effectively is a capitalist society now in all but name, the political system is bound to crumble, because you can't have economic freedom and political authoritarianism. That's proved not to be true so far. And the question is, what do they do about it? That's the great unanswered question. But, you know, going back to what you said earlier, Sue, I think for Americans themselves, brought up with the idea of perpetual progress, the question is, America owned the 20th century. It innovated, it was richer, it was more military, more powerful than anyone else. Who's going to run the 21st century? And for any American who thinks about this, and many, many, many of them do, the answer is, well, it's either us or the Chinese. And frankly, at the moment, we're not sure which it'll be. And that's one of the reasons for the kind of, you know, the quivering in the soul.
Yeah. Well, as always, Jim, you've got a very...
I want to hear about your first visit. What do you remember?
Well, my first visit to America was, I think I actually got it. How did I get there? I flew in on my own, and I was meeting a friend who lived in Boston, and she said, stay a couple of nights in any hotel that's near 42nd Street, because there you will see New York as it is after 9 p.m.
Wow.
And I was terrified, because I was on my own.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. And there was, everyone said, lock your door, you know, bar it. And there was a funny sort of door within the door, which I didn't know what it was. And in the morning, I discovered what it was, because a very nice black-faced lady poked her head through and said, hello, do you want anything washed? Can I take anything down to the laundry for you? Thank you very much. And I thought, my God, anyone can come into this room by opening the door outside and just...
Well, you stay in a better class of hotel than I usually inhabit, too. But, you know, it's quite true. You know, in the 70s, I mean, 42nd Street was pretty rough. I mean, when I was first there and used to go down as a student, I was upstate. And, you know, people were selling heroin openly in the streets, and there were people with guns, and it was a very, very rough place. Now, you know, when people said don't go on the subway after dark in New York in the 70s, they actually meant it. Whereas now, you know, the subway, whatever they tell you, the subway's fine. I mean, you don't want to go to some parts of the city, but, you know, you take the subway in Manhattan, I mean, it's perfectly okay. And New York, in many ways, has cleaned up its act, but the infrastructure's falling apart. That's Biden's other great secret, by the way, infrastructure. And you know who he's put in charge of it? Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and he's going to be the miracle worker.
You know how to pronounce it, which is good.
Well, I had to learn. Yes, it's boot edge edge. That's how you remember it. You know how you used to have to write these funny names. Remember, John Sargent used to say when Ahmadinejad came in, it was I'm a dinner jacket, and he said, if you remember that, you get it right.
Well, now we've had some interesting questions coming in from people watching this and listening to this. Jim, so and the one I find quite intriguing is it goes back to something I gather I said earlier this evening. Reflecting back, this is for you, Jim.
Yes.
Reflecting back upon your comments of the divisions to the time of the Vietnam War, Alan has asked a somewhat dark question about the possibility of a civil war in the US.
Well,
do you think that is actually something that might happen?
Well, let me put it like this. I've been terribly struck by the extent to which not just people in politics, but serious people and, you know, historians and people who think about public affairs in the last 5 years have made analogies in terms of the disruption in the country with the Civil War period in the 1860s. It's now perfectly common for people to say this country has not been so divided since Lincoln was president and you know, was bringing the country together towards the end of the Civil War when he was killed. And that is remarkable because 30 years ago, people didn't say that. I mean, of course, in the South, they still talked about the Civil War that had gone the wrong way, you know, when they fought the United States. But I think that many people do fear that there'll be schisms which don't manifest themselves in the same way. I mean, no one's talking about a serious Confederate challenge to the existence of the Republic, although you do get secessionists, especially in the West, shouting their mouths off from time to time. No one's talking about that, but you could have a divide, and a permanent divide, people fueled by conspiracies who live in a world of strange far-right TV channels that none of us have ever heard of. I mean, I'm not referring to Fox News here, where they only hear the wildest kind of theorizing. And it's very, very hard to know how you get them back into what we might call, you know, a normal public discourse where you agree to agree or disagree. And I think that's a real problem for them. And it's a cultural problem for Biden. You know, if he can engineer some kind of successful economic recovery, and he's quite lucky because out of COVID, there is bound to be a huge bounce back. I mean, there just will be because things have been so bad. And that's going to be an assistance because suddenly people are going to feel better. But, you know, there is a cultural problem underneath that has got to be spoken to. And I think a lot of serious people in politics and public affairs in the States are really, really concerned that there's a whole generation that may be lost.
Well, here's another question from Patrick, who says, this is for Jim, of course, what are the chances that Biden could be a new Johnson, someone with the reputation of being a conservative politician who ended up with some radical achievements, particularly domestic? Question from Patrick.
Well, I think it's a good analogy. Johnson, of course, was destroyed by the war in '68, but and Biden doesn't have the Vietnam War. Biden doesn't have that hanging over him. Johnson, of course, famously succeeding Kennedy, brought in a series of reforms called the Great Society, and piloted through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which he managed to push through because he knew all the Southern senators, and he basically twisted their arms so far up their back that they couldn't breathe. That's a polite way of putting it. Biden is a wheeler dealer like that. He doesn't have Johnson's toughness. He doesn't have Johnson's roughness, nor some of his guile. But, it's surprising how many people will say to you, this may be the moment for an 80-year-old guy with experience who almost certainly won't run again one term. He's not a guy with ambitions. He says he probably wouldn't have run if that riot in Charlottesville in 2017 of white nationalists, after which Trump said there were fine people on both sides, hadn't shocked him to the core, and he decided to have another run, his third run for the presidency. And I think there's something in what Patrick says that he's the unexpected figure in a way. I was reading a poll from Nat Silver in the New York Times was saying last February, a year ago exactly from this week, his kind of polling exercise in the New York Times gave Joe Biden a 5.9% chance of being the next president. I mean, he came back from nowhere in the primaries. And I think Biden's got a chance. It's no more than that. I mean, things could go horribly wrong. Events, dear boy, events, as Macmillan always said. But Biden has got a chance because he's got a fair bit of goodwill. And I think that if he can get through his first 6-9 months, he might not have too bad a time, but oh boy, it'll be difficult. It'll be difficult.
Let's hope he has a good time, because I think he sounds like and looks like a good man.
You're going to tell the story of meeting a presidential candidate on the ski slopes. I was hoping you would tell that story.
Well, let me read this letter out to you first, and then I'll try and remember that. Yes, I think, was this a French ski slope?
No, it was Elizabeth Dole you met on a ski slope in New Hampshire.
Oh, okay. Well, now, while I cogitate about that, let me just read the letter we've got from Louise. How much do you think that Black Lives Matter movement will impact on US politics?
Huge. After the George Floyd killing in Minnesota last year, it's estimated, nobody can be absolutely sure, but the estimates are that 20 million Americans joined one of the demonstrations across the country. And I think there was a real shock. People have taken to calling race, the race problem, America's original sin, the problem that wasn't expiated after the Civil War. And it's true. And I think that those divisions, which frankly Trump deliberately stoked up as a matter of politics, particularly talking about immigrants from Mexico and so on, as far as Hispanics are concerned, and making a distinction between what he called, true, he didn't exactly say indigenous Americans, but we knew what he meant, because very few Americans are true indigenous Americans in public life. Incidentally, Biden has put a Native American in charge of the agency that looks after water, national parks, and land. Very, very important to Native American tribes, their rights and so on. I mean, that was not noticed outside the States. Why should it be? A really profoundly interesting move. I mean, he gets it. And if you look at a picture of the upper reaches of his administration, women, people of color, Hispanic and African Americans, huge. I mean, it just looks completely different from the previous one. And just to answer your question simply, Louise, I think the Black Lives Matter thing and all its tentacles was a sea change moment, and it's not going to go away. Everyone knows it.
Another question for you, Jim. What damage have both Trump and Johnson caused to the special relationship, and do you think it still exists?
Well, a special relationship is a phrase you hear a great deal from British journalists when they go to the White House to do interviews. It's not a phrase you hear very often in Washington. I mean, the special relationship, I mean, obviously there's a cultural relationship based on language, which is very warm and friendly. The cultural relationship really is intelligence and defense. I mean, that's the core of it and has been since the Second World War. That doesn't change, and that will still be there. A lot of it, does depend on personality. What Boris Johnson, I think, is hoping, having cuddled up to Trump, pretty clearly, and of course, you've got to be friends with an American president. I mean, there's not much choice, but there are ways of doing it. I think that he will use his green credentials, as he sees them, to endear himself to Biden. And he will say that he's going to be a reforming, climate change reforming prime minister, and that's a great link. Well, that may work or it may not work. The people in the upper reaches of the Biden administration think that Brexit was an act of national self-harm. There's no question about that. I mean, they think it was mad. Blinken did an interview on one of the podcasts not that long ago where he, I think, used that word. So the incoming administration does not think much of the decisions that were promoted by Boris Johnson in the Brexit referendum, leaving aside what people watching tonight, including me, think about it. That is the view from Washington. But of course it'll be friendly. I mean, Biden's first task, and just leave it at this, Biden's first task, and he wants to make a big show of it, is to re-engage with allies who felt shut out by Trump, right across Europe, particularly, NATO countries, but Europe more generally, and that includes Britain. Now, of course, he'll make a visit to Ireland. There's a village claiming him somewhere in the west of Ireland. I mean, I went to Ballyporeen with Reagan, which was, God, it was like a remake of Brigadoon. It was quite extraordinary. So it'll be Joe Biden, he'll be doing that. He might do that before he comes here, but he'll get on fine. I mean, Biden's a backslapping guy, as I said, and he knows London very well. He's got lots of British friends. I think he'll put a big hitting ambassador in London, and it'll be, you won't notice the joins.
Here's a theory. It may be the very last question for you from one of your admirers, it would seem, Jim. Called Claire.
Sounds so surprised.
Yeah, Claire. No, not at all. Claire Newton is her name. How much power and influence, and I'm very interested in this question too myself, will Kamala Harris have? Huge. Kamala Harris, yeah. Huge. If anyone doesn't know, of course, she's the new vice president.
Vice president. I mean, she was chosen by Biden primarily because she was a safe choice. If you're running for office and you're 78, which he was for most of the campaign, he's 79 now, he was 79 in November.
Yeah, amazing.
You need to answer the question that nobody dare ask, what if you keel over? And so it had to be somebody who was a credible figure from the point of view of wielding executive power, if it came to it. Former Attorney General of California, senator, of course, before she was picked to be vice president, and a very, very impressive woman. Now, of course, also a symptom of diversity, mixed parentage, African-American roots,
she's got it all,
Caribbean roots, and Indian roots as well. So, she symbolizes the kind of change that's going on in America. And, most people don't know much about it, except that she's a very ferocious prosecutor. She's a very bright woman. But I think it is very, very obvious. You see the first pictures from the Oval Office of Trump signing executive orders. These are the things the president can do without getting legislative approval. And he signed a whole flurry of them to reverse Trump executive orders, for example, on environmental regulation, Paris climate change, all that kind of stuff. I did 15 in his first day. And Kamala Harris is always there. Now, that's not been true. Biden had a close relationship with Obama when he was vice president, of course, but it was never as close to that. I mean, Biden is making a point of saying, you are my sidekick and you are always there. I think we'll see a great deal of her, not least because, of course, in a 50-50 Senate split, she has the casting vote. And on all the big votes that come up on the voting rights legislation, on climate legislation, environmental legislation, on Obamacare, on the courts, Harris will be there to cast her vote to give the Democrats a majority. She's going to be very, very visible.
Yeah, very. She gives that impression already. That's great. And just that was going to be the last one I allowed you, Jim. But there's one more called an anonymous attendee, and I rather like the question: what about Biden and Putin? Is he likely to have a conversation with him too?
Oh, well, yes. And I mean, Biden knows Putin. They negotiated when he was vice president. I mean, the general view is that, Putin was able to wrap Trump around his little finger. Yeah. And that is no longer the case. I mean, it's obviously going to be a difficult relationship, but the way that Trump dealt with the Ukraine crisis would not be repeated under a Biden administration. And the interesting thing about Biden's team is that the people he's got in the National Security Agency, in defense and in the State Department are old hands. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll make the same mistakes, particularly in the Middle East of the first 10 years of the 21st century, but they're people who've lived and breathed foreign policy for 30 years. They know everybody. I mean, they'll be on the phone to Paris or on the phone to London, or on the phone to Berlin. And of course, all they can hear coming down the line is huge sighs of relief. I mean, whatever the policy is, but at least we know what it's going to be. So the rebuilding of alliances will be big. And of course, what the Germans were paranoid about was watching Trump going into a Helsinki summit with Putin and going into the room alone with him, apart from a translator. I mean, unheard of. And they said, what's he saying to him? And they still don't know. And there's going to be none of that. And I think the relationship with, Biden's got quite a few people around him who are very hawkish on Russia. And we're going to say, if you try to flex your muscles, because the truth is that after Trump's performance, Putin has a foothold in the Middle East, which he didn't have before. And he's expanded. Obviously, there was Crimea and then Ukraine. And, the Baltic countries are very worried. And they were extremely worried what would happen if there was a second term of Trump. Well, that no longer is a possibility. And in case anybody asks, I'm sure somebody's desperate to ask it, will he run again in 2024? Of course, if he were convicted, he has been impeached, but if he were convicted by the Senate, he would not be able to run. I don't think he will be convicted by the Senate, but I think the hopes of his most stalwart supporters that he might run again will be dashed in one way or another.
Jim, that must be it, unfortunately. But thank you very much indeed.
It's a great pleasure. I mean,
and just below you, as you can see, is Steve Crawshaw, who's going to wind this up with his usual flair. And
Well, Sue, can I just say, well, it's always nice. We usually meet in person, but it's very, very nice to meet in this strange way.
Fun to meet like
and I think everybody should know that we've spent more hours together early in the morning than you can imagine. usually having a good laugh, I think it would be fair to say. Lovely to see you.
Yeah,
and you.